Hi, welcome to week 2 of International Trade Economics 360. What we're going to do today is go essentially over some of the highlights of chapter 3. If you still recall, we said that historically you went through that period of having empires and then mercantilism, and then free trade started appearing on the scene as a result of the ideas of Smith, later on Ricardo, and the other major development would be Heckscher Ohlin. We spoke a little bit about mercantilism, and we sort of indicated that Smith gets the credit for being maybe one of the most important people in just showing that it doesn't work. It is easy in retrospect to see why it doesn't work, but at the time, for over 300 years, it was very dominant, and not enough people realized that a zero-sum game cannot benefit everyone. And the whole idea of international trade was to replace that theory of a zero-sum game with something that could benefit all the players. Otherwise, some people then would not have any incentive to play. One of the things that I wanted to speak a little bit about, which we didn't last time, is that one of the first major, very strong criticisms of the idea of the mercantilists was the one that was done by Hume. If you've noticed, by the way, I've prepared a couple of things, certain ideas, and I jotted them on the board only so that I wouldn't have to be doing it, in particular the quantitative, as we're talking. So this way it will save us around 10 or 15 minutes, and so it will make it easier for you to go ahead and listen to this particular clip, or the clips if I can prepare a few things in advance. So what is it that is the single most important thing about Hume? He was able to show, I would say from my point of view conclusively, that a mechanism such as that of the mercantilism would not work. It will collapse as a result of certain internal pressures, inconsistencies. That's to say, what was the major idea of the mercantilist? To try and gain power through accumulating gold and bullion, which is known also as specie. And they were operating under the assumption that you can go on forever accumulating the gold and bullion. Hume developed an argument which is known as the price specie flow mechanism, in which he showed that even though your goal is to go ahead and accumulate some more specie, that by itself eventually will reverse the process, so you'll not be able to keep on accumulating forever. The argument is rather simple, and it is explained in the book, but just so that we don't take it for granted, let me just say a few words about it. If a country is going to accumulate gold, how does it do that? We said by accumulating certain surpluses. So you run a trade surplus by exporting more than you are importing, and therefore the amount of gold in the coffers of the government is going to increase. What will happen when the amount of gold increases? There is a theory that I hope some of you know, but just in case that you don't know, is known as the quantity theory of money. Very many people on the conservative side still apply it up until now, so there is lots of credibility to the general idea. It doesn't apply 100%, but there is lots of truth to it. What the quantitative theory of money says is that the way that the economy operates is according to a particular formula, or identity I should say to be precise, because the equality sign in this case is really an identity and not an equality. It says MV is equal to PY. That's to say the money supply multiplied by the velocity is equal to the price times the number of transactions in that particular society. Which simply means that as money supply increases, all other things being equal, and if the economy is at full employment, then the price level will go up. Those of you who keep up with current events, and I hope all of you do, this is in essence has been one of the strong arguments against the policies of the Federal Reserve by some economists in the United States for the past 5-6 years, ever since the Great Recession, ever since 2008. Many people are afraid that the quantitative easing that was followed by the Fed is going to result in much greater money supplies. And they're afraid, therefore, that the greater money supply is going to reflect itself in inflation. So those who fear inflation are the ones that have been accumulating gold. And this is one of the reasons why is it whenever that particular camp that argues that this money supply from quantitative easing is going to reflect itself in much higher inflation, they go ahead and buy gold. But up until now, we've got to admit that it hasn't happened for a variety of reasons. This isn't the place to get into it because of the time and because really this isn't about money and banking. However, let's go back to the mercantilists. So you have a country, therefore, say Great Britain. So say Great Britain was able to accumulate gold and to increase its accumulation of gold during a particular period of time. As that gold increased, therefore money supply increased. If it is already operating at full employment, which is one of the assumptions that we're going to make, then the price level will go up. But as the price level goes up, what happens to the competitiveness of the British goods? The British goods all of a sudden are going to lose their competitiveness, so they will not be able to export as much and they will be forced to import more, because the imports right now would become more competitive than the exports. So whatever has started as being an accumulation of specie has forced the price level up, which makes you to lose competitiveness, which means that in the next cycle you will not be able to accumulate specie, but you will actually lose specie. And this is something that, I don't want to jump into future chapters, but this is something in a sense very similar to what goes on these days whenever countries accumulate either surpluses or deficits. They affect the level of performance of the domestic economy. And so international trade is going to reflect, the more that an economy is integrated into the world economy, and as we mentioned last time, the more dependent it is on international markets, then the more of a role is that international market going to play in the domestic economy. So we have no choice, therefore, but to pay attention to these things. But as we said last time, the biggest strike against mercantilism was really delivered by Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. And he's the one who came up with the idea of the absolute advantage. But whenever you speak about trade for the rest of this semester, for the rest of your life, I very seriously doubted that there will be another figure that will be as influential and as major as that of Ricardo. So whenever you speak about trade, we don't normally refer to Smith, or Hume for that matter, or anybody else. All the theories are based on the single most important contribution of all, and that is of Ricardo. Now, what is it that is so important about Ricardo? Ricardo was able to answer the question that Smith did not even raise. It might not have even occurred to him, or he just wasn't able to provide an answer, so he never asked the question. And the idea is, if you still recall, in Smith it was really very simple. If you have two parties, either domestically or internationally, it makes no difference. A can produce a particular item more competitively than B, and B can produce another item more competitively than A, then it makes only sense for each of them to go ahead and specialize 100% in the production of that item in which they have a tremendous absolute advantage, and then they'll be able to trade, and both of them will benefit. To go back to the example that we used earlier from Smith, I mean, can you imagine if every single one of us is going to be the candle maker and the butcher and the make our own clothes or whatever it is? Then it might take some of us, I know, let's assume maybe a week to go ahead and be able to make an item of clothing, while those that specialize in it will be able to make it in only an hour. So why should I spend a week in order to make an item of clothing if my next door neighbor can make it only in an hour? And I would go ahead and specialize in that which I can do best. So my next door neighbor will produce only the shirts, and I'll go ahead and produce shoes, and somebody else will produce something else, and then we'll trade with each other, and all of us will benefit. But what is the shortcoming in this? There's a very important shortcoming I hope that many of you have thought of. And the shortcoming is very simply, what happens if we have one country, one party, that is more efficient in the production of everything? Would there be any need for trade? And most of us, and I wouldn't be surprised if all of you, would say no. Why should we trade? I can produce both items more efficiently than the other party, then there's no need for us to trade, because we just cannot benefit. And this is precisely the genius of Ricardo. Ricardo came up with what is known as the comparative advantage. So he said you don't need any longer an absolute advantage in order to trade and in order to benefit. It is sufficient for you to have a comparative advantage. So although your next door neighbor or the other country in the world is more competitive in the production of everything, yet both of you can specialize, both of you can trade, and both of you will become better off. And ever since then, things have never been the same. All what we have added through Heckscher-Ohlin and through certain other things, we've added lots of sophistication to the analysis of the Ricardian model and to its implications. But the basic idea is still the same. We really have not changed that idea. There is a slight shortcoming about an issue that he wasn't able to address, which we'll talk about later on, and that would be the Heckscher-Ohlin. But essentially, what he's saying is that we don't need to worry about Japan, or you don't need to worry about China or about Timbuktu. If a particular country is going to become more efficient in the production of everything, this doesn't mean that you can't trade. There will always be room for trade. There's only, by the way, sorry about that, there's only one set of circumstances whereby there will be no trade. And it is extremely rare that it's going to happen, but there is scientifically a particular set of circumstances whereby trade doesn't take place. And we'll talk about it in a minute. So, before we go ahead and do some of the numerals, I wanted to again take the opportunity and highlight a few things that are not as highlighted in the book, that I happen to think that are extremely, extremely important. So I jotted them down very quickly over here, and not in any particular order, to try and make it clear that both the classical model of economics and the classical model of trade of both Smith and Ricardo are founded on a certain set of principles, like in everything else, in any field of endeavor that you can think of. Model building is determined by the set of axioms. So you're going to have to make certain assumptions, and you use these assumptions, these axioms, to build a particular model. So what are some of the important details that we speak about in this particular case? Well, the economy, one of the single most important thing, by the way, is that it's got to be a perfectly competitive economy. So we assume that there is perfect competition. As those of you who understand what I'm talking about already, this is really one of the problems when you speak about, when you are critical, speak critically about trade in the current world. Do we have any countries whatsoever whereby the economy is described as being perfectly competitive? And the answer is no. So as you can see, that is one of the reasons that we run into the problem. Not because the theory is wrong, but because the world does not conform totally to the theory. That's to say, we describe a world that doesn't exist, in a sense. So we're assuming right now that all economies are going to be perfectly competitive. What does it mean if they're perfectly competitive? It means that there are no externalities. That's to say, the price in the market is the right price. And those of us who know the concept of externalities, we know that the price in the marketplace is never the right price, because of that problem of the cost of externalities, that's to say, the certain costs that the market does not recognize. A very simple example, I drive my car, and by driving my car I emit CO2. Do I have to pay for the CO2? For the cleanup of that emission? No. So the price of my activity does not take into consideration that particular cost. Therefore, it turns out to be a fictitious price. The other important thing that we're going to assume, by the way, always and forever, you assume rationality. All economic actors are assumed to be rational players. Without rationality, the whole edifice will fall apart. Because I have to act rationally. I have no choice. Because if I'm not going to act rationally, then there wouldn't be any logic in constructing any of these models. The other thing that we're going to assume is that we assume that there are going to be no trade barriers, no barriers whatsoever. And again, we know that that's not true. I mean, even if a particular country happens to be one of the most liberal countries in the world, most countries, all countries actually, have a number of rules and regulations to impede trade. And we're going to talk later on in certain other chapters about very many of these particular ideas. But very simply, what about customs? All tariffs are nothing else than an attempt to try and interfere with trade. Quotas and very many other things, right? The other thing that you have to assume that is also very, very essential to this is that you assume that we're going to have, and we mentioned that last time, the labor theory of value. So it's the labor that is embedded in that particular item that determines the value of that particular item. In order for us to have trade, we're going to assume, we're going to construct a model of only two countries. And each of them is producing only two goods. Now, this is a restriction that can be removed in the real world, and it wouldn't affect the outcome. But for the sake of a simple presentation and illustration on a blackboard, or a whiteboard in this case, it is much easier to use, definitely, especially if you're going to use graphical presentations, to use only two dimensions. So we'll have to restrict ourselves only to two. But mathematically it can be shown, and we're not going to worry about it for this course, that whatever is true of 2 countries is true of 100 countries. Whatever is true of 2 goods is true of 1,000,000 goods, and so on and so forth. So that is a convenient restriction only for the sake of illustration. But the other thing that is important once we make these assumptions is that we're going to make certain assumptions about factor mobility. So we assume that all factors of production are perfectly mobile within that particular country. That's to say, labor can move from the production of A to the production of B. You remember the example that we used last time, we spoke about wine and cloth. So labor can move from wine to cloth, or from the production of cloth to wine. It's the market that will determine whether the move is going to be one way or the other. But you assume that that is going to happen. However, factor mobility is assumed not to exist across borders. So labor and capital cannot move from country A to country B. It will have to be restricted to that particular country. And in particular, by the way, the natural resources. So they were speaking about factor mobility domestically, but no mobility whatsoever on an international scale, about labor theory of value, about the fact that once they decide to trade, they will have to adopt 100% specialization. We're going to assume that we have 2 countries, that all actors are rational, and that we know what are the natural endowments of each of the countries, and these endowments are fixed. Let's say we don't have the right to assume that we're going to wake up tomorrow and find out all of a sudden that we have discovered a new particular physical asset that we didn't know that existed right now. So the physical endowments, you know what they are, and they're not going to change. Because that is very important, as you probably know, for the creation of any model. You've got to make certain assumptions, and you'll assume that these endowments are going to be fixed. The other thing is that we're going to assume that the technology is going to be the same. That's to say, you cannot assume that country A has a process of production that is superior to that in country B. So both of them are going to be using the same level of technology. And we've already indicated that it's a perfectly competitive market. There are no barriers. And I must add, by the way, just two more things to make it more or less complete. We're going to assume, as we've mentioned last time, that trade is balanced. And then the other thing is that we're going to be speaking about only one factor of production. Notice we speak only about labor. So there's only one factor of production in these models. Now, keeping that in mind, what do we wind up with? What is it that we're talking about before we get into the numbers? We're really talking about a certain set of assumptions that will allow you to draw what is known as the production possibility curve of a particular nation. So you have a particular country, you know what are its resources, you know the level of technology, and you're going to devote all of these resources for the production only of two goods. So what does that mean? That means that you can take all of these resources and find out how much of wine you can produce. If all your resources are going to be in wine, this will be the maximum amount of wine that you're going to be able to produce. If you take all the resources and you put them into the production of another commodity, cloth, then this will be all the cloth that you can produce. Now, but we know that nobody is going to produce only wine or only cloth, at least if it's an autarky. So we're going to try and calculate all the different points of view and combinations in between. Now, what's going to be the shape of that production possibility curve? If you still recall, some of you have taken the either 105 or 106, the production possibility curve is normally looked upon as being concave to the origin, because we assume increasing opportunity cost. We're going to simplify it for our purposes right now, and we're going to assume that we have constant opportunity cost. So this becomes a straight line. It's a very linear relationship. That's to say, the same rate of exchange for the first unit is the same rate of exchange as the one for the nth unit. So this will be, for example, the production possibility curve for England, wine cloth, and this will be the production possibility curve for Portugal, again, wine cloth. But the rates of exchange for each of them is going to be different, i.e. the slope is going to be different. So the slope for the curve for one country will be different than the slope for the other country. And that is what we mean, what I meant earlier, by the way, when I said that there's only one condition when they can trade. If both slopes are the same, that's the only time when they can trade. As long as the slopes are different, there will always be trade. And what does trade accomplish in these graphical terms? All what it does, by the way, and I constructed a very small, brief diagram over here, is that if this was the domestic prior to trade, then this country could produce anywhere over here and consume anywhere over here. Why? Let's assume that it produces over here, and by moving downward, it will just be exchanging A for B, wine for cloth. And it will wind up with any combination along this line, right? If another country right now offers you trade at this rate, then you'll be able to produce this, and you'll be able to trade down, for example, to this. So what did you find out right now? At this point, you'll be consuming more of A and more of B, more of wine and more of cloth. Your resources are still the same, but you were able right now to consume more. Why? Because you were offered a term of trade internationally that is better than your domestic terms of trade. That's the whole idea for trade. So somebody has got to offer you a trade, a term of trade overseas that is more convenient than the one that you have at home, that is more profitable for you. And they will always do that as long as they have a domestic term of trade, because this is really the domestic term of trade, the slope of this production possibility curve, that is different than yours. As you'll find out once we look at the numerals in a minute, what you're going to be really suggesting is that there is a limit to the terms of trade, to the international terms of trade. The international terms of trade cannot be any kind of a terms of trade, but they will have to be the terms of trade that lie somewhere between the domestic terms of trades of the two countries that are concerned. Now this will become clearer once we look at the numbers, I hope, but let me therefore go ahead right now and look at these figures. Let me see right now. Okay. Now this is the absolute advantage. If you still recall, we went over it last time and I tried to use the same figures. We assume that we have two countries, and the two countries are Portugal and England. They're producing wine and cloth. This is a labor theory of value. That's to say, this is the cost of production of a unit of wine in hours and the cost of production of a unit of cloth in hours. So in Portugal, they produce one wine for 2 hours and one cloth for 10. In England, they produce one wine for 8 hours and one cloth for 10. One cloth for 1, sorry. And therefore it is very evident, right, that the Brits are going to have an absolute advantage in the production of cloth, while Portugal has an absolute advantage in the production of wine. In that particular case, remember, to be able to compare things, baskets that have the same components, we say, let us look at the cost in labor hours, right, of that particular basket prior to trade, and we call that autarky, right? So under autarky, what would it cost to produce one of each by each of the countries? That's to say, our overall basket is going to be one wine and one cloth in Portugal, one wine and one cloth in England. To produce that, the total hours are going to be 21 hours. Under trade, remember, we're going to go right now to 100% specialization. So England is going to produce 2 cloth, and Portugal is going to produce 2 wine. So what does it take to produce the 2 wines by Portugal? 4 hours. 2 cloth by England, 2 hours. So the total is 6. So what have they gained? Right now they have exactly the same identical level of production, but they still have what? They have been able to free 15 hours of labor. And these 15 hours of labor, they can do with them whatever they want. They can either produce more, or they can, as we said, get involved in any other activity that they choose. So definitely, therefore, there have been gains of trade. Now, remember what we said last time. Up until now, we don't know how to deal with this. Smith didn't deal with it, even Ricardo didn't deal with it. How are the 15 going to be divided? Now that becomes obviously the problem. But under free trade, no one will accept to trade if they're going to lose. So the maximum, the worst case scenario, will be for the 15 to go only to one country vis-a-vis the other. But chances are that in the real world they're going to be able to go ahead and agree on an international terms of trade that will allow them to go ahead and share that 15 one way or the other. There is one example that I worked out last night. I don't think I'm going to do it right now. I will do it probably in a different segment because I don't want this segment to become too long. Whereby I will show you what will happen once we use wages. So to become realistic, we just don't talk only about labor, but we want to find out what are the wages that are paid to labor. And we'll find out how is it that the wages to labor are going to also affect the potential for trade. But that has been clear so far. So what is it that we're trying to do then in this case? We're trying to show, if you still recall, that there is one question that Smith did not raise. Not only did not answer, he did not even raise it. And that question is that what will happen, notice to these, I tried to use again the same figures. I kept the figures for Portugal the same, and I tried to make England more competitive in the production of each commodity. So I kept, as you can see, Portugal, 2 hours per wine, 10 hours per cloth. All what I changed is, let's assume that England can produce a wine for half an hour, therefore it is operating at an advantage compared to Portugal, and let's assume that it produces cloth at 1, therefore it is more advantageous for them, they have an absolute advantage in the production of cloth. Say for example that this is Japan and this is the United States. So at one point, we used to be more efficient, say, in the production of cars. They used to be more efficient in the production of steel. Right now, we're saying that we've become more efficient in the production of cars and in the production of steel. If we're more efficient in both the production of cars and the production of steel, and these are the only two commodities in the world, is there any room for trade? Most people would have said, and even Smith, I imagine, would have said that, although he didn't really address it because the idea didn't occur to him. They would have said, no, there is no need for trade right now. Because there are no absolute advantages in everything, so no one can specialize. Ricardo said, yes, in spite of this, there is a comparative advantage. That's to say, England, in this case, enjoys a greater advantage in the production of cloth than it does in wine. So although it has an advantage in the production of both, it should go ahead and specialize in that commodity in which it has the greater advantage. And that's what's meant by comparative advantage. And the implication of this are some of the single most important things that, as I said, have changed everything about trade. Because it's saying, remember that you don't have to worry right now that another country is gaining more advantage in the production of one commodity or the other. You're saying that irrespective of that, there is going to be room for trade and for specialization. You specialize in that in which you enjoy the greatest advantage, The other country specializes in that in which it has the least disadvantage. Let's see right now, by the way, if the figures make sense. So you have these two countries. Again, they're going to be an autarky. There's not going to be any trade. So what's going to be the total cost of production of that particular basket of one of each under no trade? Is going to be 10, 12, 13 and a half. So they can produce this basket for 13 and a half labor hours, right? Now what happens under trade? Remember what we're saying is that England is going to specialize in that in which it has the greatest advantage, which is cloth. Portugal will specialize in that in which it has the least disadvantage, which is going to be wine. So really the specialization in this case isn't going to change. So the cost of the particular basket after trade is still going to be the same, 6, because it's going to be 2 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1, right? This is it. 2 times 2 and 1 times 2. So it's going to be 6. So are there gains? And the answer right now is yes. Under autarky, the cost was 13 and a half. Under trade, it's 6. So you still have 7.5 hours. So there are right now gains of 7.5 hours. So in spite of the fact, or despite the fact, that one country is more competitive in the production of everything, yet there is a room for them to specialize and trade with each other. Why? Because the international terms of trade lie between the domestic terms of trade. Now, what are the domestic terms of trade? The domestic terms of trade, for example, for Portugal is for every 2 wines, it is 10 cloth. In England, for every half a wine, it's 1 cloth. Therefore, they are different. And if they are different, immediately it means that you can trade, because then the terms of trade, the international terms of trade, will have to lie somewhere in between. The only possibility that does not accommodate trade is that if these rates are the same, that's to say, if this is, for example, 2 to 5, and this is 2 to 10, and this is 1 to 5. 2 to 10 and 1 to 5 are going to have the same slope, right? That's to say, these two lines will be parallel. Now, if the lines are parallel, how are you going to find a rate in between that's going to be advantageous to both? You cannot do that, right? And therefore, you look for an international term that is in between. Notice this, I worked out a very simple one. I mean, it's spelled out, not that it's difficult to work. The domestic terms of trade in Portugal are 5 wines to 1 cloth, right? Because remember, this is 10 hours, this is 2 hours, so it's going to be 5 wines to 1 cloth. In England, it is 2 wines to 1 cloth. So they are different. So where is the international terms of trade? It must be in between the 5 to 1 and the 2 to 1. So what can it be? It can be, for example, 3 to 1, or it can be 4 to 1, or it can be 4.5 to 1. But it cannot be 1 to 1. If it's 1 to 1, it's outside. And therefore, what's the implication of that? The implication of that is that one country will have to lose. Now, under free trade, would you be willing to lose? No. This is the rationality assumption. A rational person will not do something that's going to hurt them. Now, could it be 6 to 1? And again, no. Because at 6 to 1, the other country is going to suffer right now. And again, under rationality and free trade, nobody will engage in an activity that is going to cause harm. Because we are, by definition, by the way, in economics, as Homo economicus, we are pleasure seekers. So we're not going to go ahead and choose something that's going to hurt us. Now, I hope that this has been clear. I'm going to have to stop right now, because although initially I wanted to go a little bit further, I will do another short clip later on for the second week. So we'll wind up with 2 clips in which I will work out a problem using wages and give you another graphical illustration. So what I will do, instead of just extending this particular clip, I will go ahead and try to again put most of the material on the board ahead of time in order for us to just gain a few minutes in the presentation, and we'll take it from there. Okay, bye-bye.